Okay, welcome level 2 participants to week 3 of our spinal art class. And you're all very welcome. We had a little break for St. Patrick's weekend, so plenty of time to do your homework. And I think as a result, we didn't get a whole lot of photos this week of the backgrounds, but that doesn't matter. It's the finished pieces that are really of interest to us. But Claire sent on her background pages in progress and a really interesting experiment that she did there on the right-hand side with the Posca pens on a plastic beaker, which I think is very effective and very decorative. And we were having a little chat through WhatsApp about maybe how you could draw on glass, because I know that you can bake it in the oven. That could be in the slide deck from last week at a temperature to cure the Posca onto the surface, so it would make a really nice gift. So last week we were working on our shadows and the basic shapes of our lemons, and we're going to this is kind of where I left my lemons last week. I started another one with a different colored background, but we built up some flat layers of coloring pencil on the shadow section of our line drawing. And we achieved those line drawings by taking a little outline of the lemon. And you can do that with other objects as well, and also projecting the light across the lemon to get a cast shadow. So I added 2 coats of gesso on those lemons, and they're fully dry now. So this week we're going to add paint and mix shades of acrylic to make these look more lemony. So we'll take the next slide and have a look at preparing the palette. So in this, like, why do artists use a palette? Really to hold and mix paint. The traditional ones were very flat wooden with the thumb hole, but I think if your palette is white, it's showing the paint off to its best condition. You can really see the colors that you're mixing. It works best if it's white and washable. Some people use an old chopping board, but you'd want to be able to kind of clean it. So a slippy chopping board is probably better than one of the textured ones. Or and the reason you don't want it textured is so that old dry paint doesn't kind of get textured in with the new mix. I use a plate often as well, one that has a very flat profile, not too many lips. And when we are using acrylic paint, which is water-based, it can dry quickly. So you can store your mixed shades on a few sheets of damp kitchen roll, and that will slow the paint down from drying and keep it wet from longer, apparently by the power of science or osmosis. So I would normally take like 3 sheets of kitchen roll and dampen them under the tap and sort of squeeze out any of the heavy moisture and keep that to the side if I've mixed up a batch and I want to paint for the next hour or two. There are products on the market called Stay Wet palettes. I think they're a bit gimmicky. It's technically blotting paper with a bit of greaseproof paper on top. So you could make one yourself using a Tupperware box, or even an old Chinese container. Takeaway container is very good for keeping the damp kitchen roll in with your stored paint. As long as that surface is wet, the paint won't dry. So I'm using a disposable palette here. It's easy to demonstrate on. And the colors that I've laid out are the titanium white, primary yellow, red, and blue. And I've just included a link to the same tear off palette that I use there. They're a couple of euro if you think that's something you need in your life. It's a shiny page, so it's good for mixing on. So I'm just going to put my paint blobs out here. And there's a kind of a logic as to why I've put the yellow and white up at the top, just so that I might use more of those, especially for this type of painting. So when you're starting off, and I know our subjects aren't very big, so they're not big giant lemons, I'm nearly putting a blob out that's equivalent to the size of the lid. And that's a good indicator, because you can always add more out if you need it. Once it isn't mixy, it's very hard to get back into the tube. So you don't want to put out more than you need. Now I have a little root for some red. red, and I'm just going to put that down the side. So if you were using a plate, once you've middle section empty for a bit of mixing, you're grand. And it's a bit like how people set the table. Pooch around from my ultramarine. It's cobalt, don't want that. You know, obviously it depends on your color palette of your painting, how you would set the plate up. Or your there. A little bit of blue. Okay, so our palette's organized. You could paint or mix your paint with a palette knife, or you could do it with a brush. I tend to try and use a palette knife because it saves my brushes. So I'm going to lift some of my white and take it into the middle section, which is nice and empty. And probably going to take most of the blob that I took out. And then I'm just going to take the tiniest little bit of white first, or a little bit of yellow. And that's going to make our lightest shade. So it's a bit like salt. You can add a little bit in at the beginning. And you can keep adding the yellow in. So very tiny amount. If you are clipping your nail with a nail clipper, that's how little we really do want in. So you can see there in my first image, the tiny little smear of yellow beside the bigger blob of white. And this is going to give us our lightest lemon shade. So I'm just going to mix this up as we go along as well. Top up my white in case I need more later. So yeah, that's a good shade. That lemon, it should nearly more look like a cream color. And that will be one of our first shades. So what I do with this mix is I'm going to split what I've mixed into, take half of it and park half of it over to the side. I'm going to put it under my blob of white. And then with my half that's left over in the middle, I'm going to take a little bit more yellow again and put that into the mix and mix that through. So it's starting to look a little bit brighter, a bit more yellowy. And I'm using a palette knife, but you may find with your brush, you might need to turn, if you're mixing with your brush, you might need to turn the brush around to make sure you have no streaky bits so that it's fully mixed through. And I'll just do a very quick stop share so I can show you what my palette's looking like as well now. And look, I'll down to the table. Light isn't good. So I have my white, my yellow, that's neat. I have the first lemon color that I mixed. And then here in the center, I have my second lemon color. And I still have the red and blue untouched. I'll try and move that keyboard back. There we go. So that's my second lemon shade mixed up there. Slippy camera. And I'm going to do the same again. Split it in half. Park half of it up beside its friend there. Get all that back into the middle. And I'm not going to spread my paint blob out too far, because if I have it all spread over, it'll dry a lot quicker. So there's the first shade, the second shade, a bit like notes in the piano, and there's our neat white, neat yellow. So back to the screen share, but I'm basically going to be adding a little bit more yellow in there again. So you can see there in my slide number 3, my picture number 3, I've the two first shades mixed up. And I'm throwing another whack of the yellow in keep turning my knife because there's some pale shades lurking on the back of the knife. I'm going to try and keep all that in the center. Now, it's warm here in my studio this evening, so I'm half tempted to nip off and get me damp kitchen roll so that I can just save that on a little bit of damp kitchen roll. So bear with me a second. You couldn't make it up. There's even lemons on the kitchen roll. Too quick. I'm going to throw it on there. Lemon now. So I have my three colors lined up. So 3 shades. And if we run out, we can mix up. So that was our remaining yellow. These are the 3 shades. The dark lemon now is the last little bit of color. So it seems like a lot of work to do all your mixing first. But I find it's the best way to focus on learning to color mix because you're very out to that white to get the different shades. So I have the 3 distinct shades of lemon that I can work with. And if I do need to mix more, I can retrace my steps. And it allows me to have great control with my color mixing. Because a lot of times what happens, oh, I mixed a lovely color. I have no idea how I did it. And that can happen a little bit. But if you're quite mindful about the proportions, and it's probably the only time I'm going to sound like Weight Watchers, is just knowing how little of the yellow turns into a lemon gives you much better idea then how to mix. So I don't have a whole lot of I'm going dark lemon left, so I'm going to just make up some of that. So I'm going to add, you can see there, tiny little smear of red to start off making an orange. Again, remember how little it took. So if I even just start with a small amount of red, I can begin to see that turning into orange. If I put the volume of red in equivalent to the yellow, I'll just end up with something that's too similar to red and it's not going to give me variety. So I'm going to keep a little bit of that. And the reason we're making this orange is because now we've activated 2 of our primary colors. We have our yellow and our red. And if we take the 3rd primary color, which is the blue, and throw it in there, we're going to make ourselves really nice shade of brown. And the reason this is quite a clever way to color mix is because all the colors are related to each other then. So they're not going to be jarring. So I'm going to take my tiny little amount of blue. I'm holding it up under the camera there. You can see the little size of the blob probably on a small, on the small screen. And in that goes. And I'm going to start mixing until I get a decent brown. So she's a bit beigey there. So I'm going to throw a bit more blue in. Keep turning my knife because I had a pocket of white hiding there, which not ideal. So everyone's mix might be slightly different. If your color is looking a bit greeny, mine's looking a bit greeny here. That's going to tell me I need more red. So I'll show you this color. It's nearly like a khaki color up close on the small camera. So I know looking at that, the blue's gone into the yellow, but it's a bit green looking. I'm going to add a bit more red till I get a brown that I'm happy with. It's a bit like cooking. You kind of have to taste test a bit. And keep adding bits of blue and bits of red until you're happy with your shade of brown. I'm kind of getting there now. Again, keep turning my knife. Keep a bit of that, and I might just see if I can get it a bit darker. Now I'm just going to check that my other paints aren't drying out too much. Get them onto my kitchen roll. Yeah. So it's like a little reservoir now, keeping my paint moist so I won't be under pressure then. And we can always, you might find that depending on how many lemons you have to block in, you might find you have to mix up another little batch, but it's really good to take the time to just kind of spend mixing paint. So the light brown was made with first bit of blue. I did the same thing, split it, and then I made a bit of a dark. So I kept some of the orange, and then I had the darker brown. So this is kind of the final palette for now. And any of the mixed shades I have on the damp kitchen roll just to stop them drying out. And on the small camera, so on the little screen there's my little palette of colours smeared onto the damp kitchen roll. So I'm going to do one or two different examples of the blocking in because there's many different ways to paint. And you could be very impasto, which is very thick and very modern. Um, to shade this lemon, I'm just put an overall coat of the medium coloured lemon on. So I'm going to just pick any of the ones on my page and use my medium colour, which is my middle lemon, and I'm going to paint the whole lemon with that shade. So on top of the gesso, it should go on nice and easy. I'm using the little round brush, which is the larger of the sizes for this. Our square head was great for the background, but we're just starting a bit more detail. So and there's an old adage in painting that 3 shades of anything is better than nothing, because if you've 3 colors, you're going to achieve some effect. If you just open the tube and paint it in, anybody who's used to looking at art or looking will be able to say, they didn't mix the colors. So yeah, art snobs. But by just adding varying degrees of yellow and white, we've got a bit like notes on the piano, a whole scale of colors to work with. Now, with your brush, pushing it down will give you more control. So if you're just kind of going tip, 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 you're probably not getting a great straight line with the edge of the brush. But if you put pressure on that and then pull it round, you'll find it a lot easier to control. But it takes a little bit of practice. Sure, it's a stick with hair on the end of it, like it doesn't make sense. So it takes a while to learn to control the brush. So be patient with yourself. So I added some orange around the edges with the darkish color of my darker lemon shade, which kind of looks more orangey on my palette, all right. So I'm just going around some of the edges, but I'm leaving the middle. And because the surface is still wet and the colors are connected, they're blending in quite nicely. So I'm just going to run a bit of that darker shade around the edge. And we want to be able to see 3 distinct colors. If my brush is getting a bit claggy, I'll wash it off. And if you were at home, you weren't following along with the video, but you said, you know, got myself some limes at the weekend and I'm going to have a go at painting them in shades of green and the light reflected off them, you could set it up in front of you and really spend time looking where the light hits it, where the shadow is. You know, near the cast shadow, there's always going to be a little bit of a darker shade, and then the light hitting it on the top will be white. But we're not going to use white. We're going to use our light lemon shade for that. So you can see in the middle there, I have just a little bit of a circular application of the lighter lemon. And if you want, you can blend that in with that medium lemon too. Pick a bit of that up just so that it's not a hard edge. And alternating across those 3 colors, if you find that you've enough coverage. Now, looking at the photo on the far right, you can see that the edge that's just beside the cast shadow, you could almost say has a reflection of green in there, has a touch of brown in there. And that's adding a little bit of that, even if it's a very light wash of it, will also add a little bit more 3 dimensions to your image. So if you want to be brave, you could throw a little bit of the brown in there and then clean the brush and sort of fade it in. So I will keep the edge forced very hard along the side of the shadow. Just going to take some out of me. I've gone over into me blue. But if you find you've gone over the line a little bit with your paintbrush, clean the brush, wet it, and blot it off with a kitchen roll. So I'm just going to go back to my middle lemon colour and just touch up. That's kind of gone on quite nicely. I might add a bit more of me dark in. So you can kind of get the rhythm of it. And it doesn't have to be like a carbon copy at all. You nearly know what suits your own picture. And you can go back over if you went, you know what, I put the brown on, but it went a bit heavy. You could let it dry for a minute and go back over it with the lemon to tone it in a little bit. Because painting is all about layers. Nothing's done in one layer. And you could fiddle about with a bit of texture, maybe even some dotty paint marks, because that will kind of translate the whole notion of a citrus fruit. They're a little bit pockmarked. It's like they have little pores. So even stippling a little bit of light paint where the light is reflected. I'm going to add a little bit of brown onto not a belly button, but you know what I mean, the belly buttons at the end of the lemon. Um, and nothing has to be a definite shape. If anything, have it a little bit wonky, because if it's too definite, it borders into the cartoon land. So you want to have the shape sort of subtle, and that's the good thing about painting organic subject matter. No one's going to turn around and go, "Oh, that lemon didn't look like that." Uh, they won't know. It's like, "Oh, that leaf isn't what I was looking at," unless the subject's in front of you and you're being assessed that way. That's really not relevant. Art is about interpreting. So definitely, there is no real right or wrong here. We've got the lovely colors mixed up. So we can't go wrong. I'm even drinking lemon and ginger tea. I'm so lemony this evening. So I'm just going to tip on to the next example of blocking in. Now, this one is going to be a bit more jazzy, a little bit of texture going on. So maybe not as many of the broad strokes, but more of a stippling with the brush. And I'm going to work that in on top of one that I had half started with colouring pencil and Posca pen the last time that we met up, because I just think it'd work well together. So I'm going to go in with my medium colour, and then I'll go in with the dark colour. So this is more nearly puntillistic. You know, I'm using a series of dots to build up the texture and colour. And I'd already done a little bit of work under there with the water-soluble colouring pencil and the Posca pen. So I'm fitting in between some of them marks. So a lot of the white that was underneath is starting to disappear. Now, if you find that your brush is losing its shape, I would twirl it. So you can kind of roll it. See if I can get it in the camera. Hang on. So I sort of roll it through my fingers. It's a bit like paring a pencil, and that'll bring it back up into a point again for me. So I'm, as opposed to long, broad strokes, I'm just dotting on the paint. And I'm going to use the medium and the darker colored lemon for this, and then start introducing some of the brown, just for a bit of shade. When I have the surface covered, I'll put in some of the highlights, but I've a bit to go yet. Dotting in with the medium and dark color. And one of my favorite painters of fruit would be Cézanne and his apples. Cézanne was kind of like the godfather of the Cubists, because he altered composition in paintings so that they were more dynamic. But you can see his three colors. You can see how he nearly builds the fruit with directional painting. And it's real casual, but there's some lovely tones in the apples, that real warm sitting on a wooden surface. Right, I'm going in with some of my darker lemon now. Dab, dab, dab. And then I'll hit it up with some of the lighter lemon. And the good thing about acrylic is it loves to be layered. The more paint that gets on there, the happier the finished product. Now, time for a little bit of brown. Mine just needs a little bit of shading on one side. But there's no harsh division between any of these tones of color together, and in some ways are related, all from the same family of colors. There's great harmony between them, and that's where your color mixing gives you an edge. Yeah, dotting the brown in on that side is giving me really nice texture. Another thing I like for the texture is the end of the brush. Sometimes I pair it with a pencil pairer. So the wooden stick end, I'll show you here. I pair it so that it becomes a pointed stick. Okay, so it's like a brush with a paired end on it. And I would use that to get in some of the highlights. So I'm going to use some of the light lemon on the pointed stick end and dot them in too. Very small marks like this, you might only get 3 satisfactory dots before they need to be, the brush or the stick needs to be refilled. So I'm going to go hell for leather now with the dots, and I will take some close-up photos of these. They'll be easier to share, but you can kind of see there in photograph number 3 on the far right that heavy texture of the light lemon color gives us a sense of the light hitting it on one side. The one I'm working on tonight, because it has a little bit more brown on the cast shadow side, it's given me more 3D effect. Now my paint is still staying wet. I'm just going to remind myself what's on the next slide. Okay, so here's a close-up of our example 2 with the texture. And you can see here adding a little bit of orange, a little bit of brown on the underside of this example lemon brings depth. And use the brush here to blend it in, but keeping the brush stroke visible definitely adds texture. And it's very different to our first example, which was quite softly blended in. You can see here that this one is much more textured. And although these are very close up photographs, if this was a painting on a canvas or a canvas board or on paper, the likelihood is you wouldn't be up that close to it. There is what you call a viewing distance, which is a meter or two. So when you stand back from it, you're going to be able to appreciate the contrast a lot more because our eyes have a broader field of vision. And that's where optical mixing like this really comes into play. Now, depending what shade your background is, you can see there on the third photo, I've quite a dark line underneath the lemon, which almost working like an outline. It's going to create a great contrast between the yellow and the cast shadow of the background. So if you have a more like neutral, or let's say a light green or a light background, don't be afraid to go heavy on the shadow. So this one definitely exploits texture, adding texture with the brush. And when we start to paint, there's such a temptation to flatten everything and smoothie, smoothie, blendy, blendy. And then the thing loses shape, loses structure. So a bit like icing a cake, don't be afraid to leave some areas nicely textured. If anything, from an example point of view, when everything dries, you might say, well, I kind of like that style, but I like this style as well. Actually, just going to, now that that's had a moment to dry, just do a few more bits of texture on this one.
Susan,
Yes,
do you mean by texture like stippling type thing?
yes, yeah.
Right.
So you could, if you were using the brush, you're kind of maybe going more dab,
Dotty.
dab, dab,
Yeah.
dab, as opposed to stroking. Yeah.
Okay.
So if I look up at this, if I try and go up close on the camera, I might be able to see with the light. See the way that one's a little more dotty?
Yes, yeah.
That's my textured one. And if I can get close enough with this one, that's the kind of the smooth one. Color balance isn't great there, but it doesn't have the same texture as the
Okay.
other one. So
Thanks.
if you've ever gone to look at art in real life, it'd be like you could have daubs of paint on it as opposed to flat, smooth brush strokes. Now I'll just click into the next slide, remind myself where I am. Well, this was the mixed media where you could do a little bit of, well, kind of did a texture on my example there. So last week, or last time we met, I had done colouring pencil, Posca pen underneath that lemon. So I went hell for leather with it and added lots of paint then on top of it. And you can see a lot of texture on that, a lot of little daubs and dots. And I think it's about your personal style too, or maybe the style of the picture. You know, some might be more classically painted and quite flat, whereas some can be a bit more expressive, but it can be nice to have a little bit of both to add interest. So once the acrylic paint dries, there's absolutely nothing stopping you from grabbing Posca pens and lashing in on top of it and adding a few more dots. And I do think, and don't know, maybe one or two of the people who have painted before, there's definitely, you kind of wonder when you're putting the gesso on it, what's the point of putting this gesso on? But that paint goes on like butter with the gesso underneath. There's no resistance. It's not getting sucked into the paper. It's sitting lovely on the top there. And I suppose if if you've ever worked on a cheap canvas, you know you'd only put a bit of paint on and it gets sucked down into the cheap canvas and anything wouldn't sit in the surface. So I think that's why there's a great satisfaction working on top of something that is a primed surface like the gesso. And even though we're working on paper, we're not losing any of our brushwork down into the fibers of the paper because that's where it wants to go. It wants to suck all the paint in there. So I'm very much enjoying working on top of the pre-gessoed lemons. And it's giving me a much smoother texture as well. Like if you were doing something maybe involved skin or a face, having your surface prepared with gesso means that you're not going to be dealing with the weave of the canvas or the canvas board, which has a texture. So you can exploit things like that to your advantage, or if you wanted to have very soft petals on a flower or something like that. Something romantic like that. So we're getting quite vibrant. Well, I feel I'm getting very nice vibrant results as a result of working on top of the primed surface. And yellow is one of the most transparent see-through colors. That and green break your heart trying to build up layers of it. So adding a little bit of white in the early stages also promotes coverage because it makes it more opaque and less see-through and gives us really good coverage. I think one of the advantage of having completed more or less and done the background in a previous sitting means that it's very easy to see a good contrast between the subject this evening and if we were working on a white background, we just really wouldn't get the same contrast. So it's something to remember if you're tackling the painting of another subject. It doesn't have to be lemons or anything. Spend the time front end getting that background in because it'll push the subject matter forward. Something psychological occurs. It's the biggest area, it's the biggest space, and yet it's the space that puts the least amount of pressure on us because it's in some ways slightly overlooked. But I used to always say to the kids in school, I says, you ever see the ones that win the art competitions? Always have the backgrounds done in. Always, it could be the worst drawing in the world, it could be the worst thing in the world. But if that background's in, you're on the credit union calendar next year for sure. There's any amount of books and things about color mixing. Um, I think for myself, the whole key is really being very aware of what your primary colors can do before anything else. Because if you can work with them, you can create a whole host of colors. So even though we're only working with lemons, we still used all the primary colors in white. Because a lot of color is reflected color. You saw in one or two of the photos back there that even though the surface of the lemon was yellow, because it was on a green piece of paper, it reflected a shade of green onto the surface of the lemon. And the same theory applies for painting water and painting glass, that really you're only looking at the color through the glass or the color reflected on the water. And skin can be the same because the color will reflect on skin too. It's maybe where the certain colors that we wear make us look great or really washed out. There's a lot to be said working with a restricted palette. You get to focus on your brush stroke, pushing your color mixing, and makes things, because we're not just doing one lemon but three. We're embedding learning in a different way because we're repeating it a little bit more often. And maybe some of your earlier exploits are kind of drying a little bit now, and if you wanted to add a bit more paint on, you could. And you mightn't need the same volume of paint. You could just put a little wash on there where it's only like a thin layer, dry brushed on. The one thing about acrylic is because it's a plastic-based material, to use it best, treat it like whiskey, keep it neat. And if you're going to water it down, maybe leave that to the top layer so that you can just put on a wee wash after the earlier layers are built. And that way you're definitely going to build up great tone, because tone gives us three-dimensional shape. It gives us a bit of atmosphere as well. Lemons with personality. So I have a collection that I had been working on. They're dried out and they look wretched. So might be time to, they've turned into leather. But yeah, anything goes because they're your art journals. And I do think experimenting like this builds confidence with paint and color. It gives you time as well to just focus on little exercises. So this was the example in my book where I did the green background and a burnt sienna, which is a kind of reddish brown, and red background, just to show different effects. And I think I built up a few more layers, but the one that I did this week and last week is on a blue background. And I like it too, but it was more challenging initially to kind of figure out the shadows, because I didn't have the same flexibility against the very dark background. So I had to go very dark with the paint. So adding thin coats of paint in various shades demonstrates how layers can add effect over texture. Remember, anything goes, and experimenting definitely will always build your confidence. I'm a bit repetitive there, but I suppose it's because I want you to experiment. Oh yeah, got any leftovers? You know what I'm like for the leftovers. If you've leftover paint, don't wash it down the sink. But also don't feel compelled to keep adding it onto the picture if the picture is technically finished and you're just rooting at it and it's turning into a whole other picture, because that can happen. That's the number one crime in Artland, overpainting. So if you have a blank page, you can throw it onto the blank page. Often I would do that and then just leave it like there on the right hand side where the brown and yellow one is, and then I'll draw on top of it at a later stage, or I'll collage on top of it. But you could be neat either, and you could mask out some lines and fill it in. So it depends how much you've left over. So I've a little bit left over, so I'm just going to dry with my hands my lemons and start myself a new page, or maybe find a kind of a bit of a vacant page that might need a little bit of pizzazz. Oh yeah, I had a botched cup here, so I might cover that with some paint. Just make a fan with something so that I'll use the Spinal News to give this a quick dry.
Thanks for the promotion there, Susan.
Yes. That was autumn 2023. Yeah, so they're nice and dry now. So one thing I often notice, my daughters, if she feels that she makes a mistake on her book, she compelled to rip the page out, but the book ends up with no pages in it at all. So I tend to cover my mistakes up with more paint. So I'm just going to use my leftovers now in an arbitrary fashion. I actually used most of my yellow mixes up, so I don't have a whole lot of those to play with. I love painting with leftovers. I often would have a few on the go that become, I used to call them scrap paintings, but I thought that was a little bit biased because eventually they just built up into backgrounds. But I felt that it was a very, maybe after doing something a little more structured, like the observational painting there of the lemon, it's nice to kind of mess about in a very free way. Or if I had leftover magazine bits or newspaper, sometimes I'd throw it onto that, and then they might find their way into collages as well. Lets me experiment with techniques, brush techniques as well, or different. Sometimes I'll use the knife. I have a bit of blue and red left, so I'll just throw them together. That'll give me some kind of a weird purpley brown color. It's a bit difficult to mix purple traditionally in acrylic paint. It ends up a little flat, a little dull. If you wanted a very vibrant, traditionally, if you look at the color wheel, mixing red and blue is meant to give you purple, but you might have more success using a magenta pink shade and blue, because the magenta has a stronger pigment to work with the blue a little bit. Yeah, because this has turned out more like an aubergine shade. Scrap paintings on cardboard, great fun. And then you will find with the little tubes of paint that you might fly through the white and the yellow, but the other ones might last a bit longer. And you can buy the tube singly and replace the white and yellow as you go. I would say if you want to replace any paint, go for something that's a decent enough brand, just so it won't break your heart. Like, you could hit that aisle 5 in Lidl and buy yourself a whole box, but sometimes the paint isn't the best. The percentage of pigment to binder isn't great, and it can be frustrating for the beginner who's color mixing when you're not getting the results. And yeah, so I would say kind of invest in a brand like Winsor and Newton or Daler and Rowney. It doesn't have to be artist quality one, but at least that they're stable, because they're also manufactured in the EU, so they're to standard. And it'll do exactly what it says on the tube. So this week's, if you fancy, be lemoned out of it, slice up your lemon and study it from a different angle. You could maybe use mixed media. I can show you next. Yeah, I'll share these with Barbara, and then will come out an email for you, but it'll also be available on the recording should you wish to revisit the content again. So I'll stop share.